Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, your friendly guide to the English language. Today, we're going to look at the War of the Dots, and then we'll look at why we say things are pitch black. But first, if you got a gift card for the holidays or your New Year's resolution is to read more, I have a great offer for you. If you sign up for my Patreon, you get an amazing reading list of 100 books recommended by Grammar Girl guests, and we're also doing a special where you get 1 month free. You can cancel anytime and keep the book list, but of course, I hope you'll love what we're doing and stay. But either way, you'll get all kinds of great benefits like the ad-free podcasts, bonus podcasts, mini crosswords, and more for a whole month while you decide. So look in the show notes or show description for the special sign-up links that'll give you a whole month free plus that 100-book list. This first segment is by Karen Lundy. If you look closely at the number pad on an ATM or the sign next to an elevator button, you'll see them. Tiny grids of raised dots. Most of us brush past them without a second thought, and few of us realize that they are the result of a need for independence, a sort of war over reading standards and one teenage boy's genius. World Braille Day is coming up on January 4th, so let's look at the history. The story begins with a tragic irony. Louis Braille was born in France in 1809. His father was a harness maker, and Louis loved playing in his workshop. When he was 3 years old, he was trying to punch a hole in a piece of leather with an awl, a sharp, pointed tool, when it slipped and injured his eye. The infection spread, and by the age of 5, Louis was completely blind. Years later, Louis would use a blunt version of the same tool, the awl, to punch the dots that would become the reading system visually impaired people still use today. But first, as a student, he had to endure the standard education for blind students at the time, raised letters. These were exactly what they sound like, standard alphabet letters embossed onto heavy paper. They were huge, expensive to print, and agonizingly slow to read. Worst of all, you couldn't write them yourself. Young Louis was frustrated. He wanted to take notes, write diaries, and just communicate. And then, when he was a teenager, Braille was inspired by a former soldier named Captain Charles Barbier. If you've heard the story of Braille before, this is usually the part where it gets a little Hollywood. The popular legend goes that Captain Barbier invented a system later called night writing to help Napoleon's soldiers communicate silently in the trenches at night without lighting a lamp that would reveal their position to enemy snipers. The night writing story may have been mythologized, though. It's one of a dozen forms of alternative writing found in an 1815 book. I won't try to pronounce the original French, but it translates to the unwieldy title, Essays on Various Methods of French Shorthand, containing 12 different writing styles, with one plate for each method. It's likely Barbier originally designed his tactile writing system with visually impaired people in mind, and it was only later used by the military. But whatever its origin, Barbier's system had a fatal flaw. It was phonetic, based on sounds rather than spelling, and it used a cell of 12 dots. Now imagine trying to read a billboard while looking through a drinking straw. That was the problem with 12 dots. The cell was too tall to fit under a single fingertip. To read a letter, you had to slide your finger up and down, and by the time you processed the bottom dots, you may have forgotten the top ones. This is where Louis Braille's genius kicked in. He realized that for a tactile system to be fast as sight, the brain needed to capture the whole character in an instant. The 6-dot cell fits perfectly under the pad of a finger. You can feel the entire pattern at once, and it changed reading from a scanning process to a recognizing process. And here's where the Hollywood influence continues. There are stories of Braille confronting Barbier about the flaws in his system during Barbier's visit to his school, the Royal Institution for the Young Blind in Paris. But there's a problem with that dramatized version, too. Barbier introduced his system to the school's director, Pignet, around 1821. But he didn't meet Braille until 1833, after Braille had published his own 6-dot code in 1829. Incidentally, Braille's book was called Methods of Writing Words, Music, and Plain Song by Means of Dots for use by the blind and arranged for them. Seems like the French were all about long titles back then. And here's a fun fact for you creative types. Louis was also a talented musician who played the cello and the organ. He didn't just want to read books, he wanted to read music. So he built a musical notation system right into the code from the start. Braille started out as a one-to-one transliteration of the French alphabet. But soon, various abbreviations and even logograms were developed. Those are signs or characters that represent a complete word or phrase. So the system became more like a shorthand than an alphabet proper. Today, there are Braille codes for well over 100 languages. You might think the world would instantly applaud a 15-year-old kid for solving a problem that adults had struggled with for centuries. But if you know anything about the history of innovation, you know what comes next: the resistance. Many sighted teachers opposed Braille. It looked like alien code, it felt subversive, and it gave blind students a way to communicate that sighted teachers couldn't read. At one point, a new director at Louis's schools reportedly burned Braille books and confiscated the students' styluses. But you can't stop a good idea. The students began passing notes in Braille in secret, the 19th century equivalent of texting under the desk. The controversy eventually crossed the ocean to the United States, sparking a decades-long conflict known as the War of the Dots. It wasn't just a battle between Braille and print. It was a battle between competing dot systems. There was New York Point, which used dots that were only 2 high but could be multiple dots wide. There was Boston Line Type, which clung to the old raised letters. And then there was American Braille, which was slightly different from the French version. It was a mess. A blind person in New York might not be able to read a book printed in Boston. It took until 1932, more than a century after Louis poked those first dots, before British and American authorities agreed on a shared English Braille standard. So Braille won the War of the Dots, but how does it actually work? Well, if you're a word nerd like me, this is the best part. Braille is more than a one-to-one swap where you trade an A for a .1. It has its own linguistic layers. There are 2 main grades of Braille. Grade 1 is what you might expect, a direct transcription. If you want to write cat, you make the sign for C, the sign for A, and the sign for T. But Braille books are bulky. The paper has to be thick to hold the raised dots, and the dots themselves take up space. A Braille copy of Tolstoy's War and Peace spans 14 volumes and weighs more than 74 pounds. To save space and increase reading speed, most avid readers use Grade 2 Braille, also known as contracted Braille, which functions almost like shorthand. In Grade 2 Braille, single letters can be used for words in the right context, and single symbols represent frequent word elements like ing or tion. In our modern world of smartphones, audiobooks, and screen readers, people often ask, is Braille still necessary? Why learn a complex tactile code when Siri or Alexa can just read the text to you? The answer brings us back to the difference between information and literacy. Listening is wonderful, but reading can have additional benefits. If you only ever listen to text, you miss out on the mechanics of language. You don't see how punctuation breaks up a sentence. You don't internalize the difference between homophones like there, there, and the possessive their or the contraction they apostrophe re. And this could have real-world stakes. Studies have consistently shown that Braille literacy is directly tied to employment. Now, it could just be a correlation, but the unemployment rate for the blind community can be high, and of those who are employed, 85 to 90% are Braille readers, though the exact figures do vary a bit by study. Sadly, Louis Braille died at age 43 from tuberculosis, never knowing that the system he invented would be used around the world. But his inspiration opened a world of literacy to countless people. So this week, take notice of the dots you see in public places and give a thought to Louis Braille. And as a final aside, Braille is capitalized when referring to the man, but in both AP style and Chicago style, it's lowercase when referring to the writing system. That segment was written by Karen Lundy, a longtime writer and editor turned web designer and marketing mentor. Solo service business owners come to her for websites where beautiful design meets authentic words that actually build connection. Find her at chanterellemarketingstudio.com. This next segment is by Samantha Enslin. If you're a listener in the Northern Hemisphere, we recently passed winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. If you live there, solstice comes every year on December 21st or 22nd, the day when the path of the sun is farthest south from that hemisphere. If you live in the other half of the world, it comes on June 20th or 21st, when the sun is the farthest north from you. Either way, that day has the least daylight and the longest night. So if you're looking outside on nights these days, especially if it's cloudy, you might think to yourself that the sky is pitch black. Then, if you're like me, you start wondering what pitch is, and if it's really black, and where that phrase came from anyway. Well, here's the scoop. Pitch is indeed black, or a very dark brown substance. It's created from distilling wood tar or turpentine, and it's been used for centuries to caulk the seams of ships and to waterproof other types of wood. Pitch is an ancient word. It can be traced back to the classical Latin pix, and is probably even older than that, because it shares the same Indo-European root as the same word in ancient Greek. Its first use in English, at least recorded by the Oxford English Dictionary, dates all the way back to Old English. The phrase black as pitch appears later in the 1300s, and the adjective pitch black appears yet later in the 1500s. The spelling could also be pick, P-I-C-K. For example, a Scottish poem from that time describes the night as being grim and ghastly and pick black. And by the way, the verb to pitch, as in to pitch a tent, sounds the same as the noun and it's spelled the same, but it has a different root, and it's probably related to the verb to prick. Just a reminder that not all words that look the same have the same origin. So, long story short, something pitch black is intensely black or dark. Think of a piece of black velvet held under the covers in a darkened room. That captures the feeling of pitch blackness. So enjoy your winter, everyone, and stay warm and safe. That segment was written by Samantha Enslin, who runs Dragonfly Editorial. You can find her online at dragonflyeditorial.com. And I actually remembered an old FAMILECT that fit too perfectly with this segment not to share again. So here's that from Josh.
Hi, Mignon. This is Josh calling from Israel, longtime listener to the podcast. I just wanted to share with you a FAMILECT story. When my son was about 3 or 4 years old, he mistakenly understood the word pitch in the phrase pitch black to just be like an intensifier, meaning something along the lines of extremely or very, and would say things like pitch red or the soup is pitch hot. So we in the family, thought it was adorable and understandable, and we just went with it. And, we now use the term, the food could be pitch delicious or it could be pitch hot outside and the like. And that's just the way that a word, an adjective was misunderstood by a child and gave us a new way to intensify a noun.
FAMILECTs are words or phrases you use with your family that nobody else does. They're like your private language, and people have friend-elects with their friends, too. If you want to share the story of your FAMILECT or friend-elect, leave a message on the voicemail line at 833-214-GIRL or record a message on Speakpipe. You'll find both those in the show notes. Grammar Girl is a quick and dirty tips podcast. Thanks to Rebekah, Sebastian, and Nat Hoops in marketing, Morgan Christianson in advertising, Holly Hutchings, director of podcasts, and Dan Feierabend in audio, who likes to play video games that simulate work, like Power Wash Simulator. And I'm Mignon Fogarty, better known as Grammar Girl. And don't forget to go to the show notes or descriptions and use the links there for a free month of ad-free podcasts, fun tips, and a weekly mini crossword puzzle at my Patreon. That's all. Thanks for listening.